But let me get the program started now and introduce the chairperson of this special symposium. The motivation for doing a special symposium on the lessons of Y2K may seem to some people who don't know what really happened that it's past history and there isn't that much more to be learned. In fact, nothing could be further from the case. There is a story that has not yet come out about what really happened and what an incredibly heroic effort was made behind the scenes to avoid what could otherwise have been a disaster. And how that was done and the lessons learned from that experience are extremely illuminating. I've just had some insights from some of the material that our chairperson has sent to me, so I have only a taste of it. I'm really looking forward to this panel. So let me now introduce the chairperson of the panel, Professor Stuart Umpleby, who's a professor of management science in the School of Business and Public Management at George Washington University. He's the director of the research program in social and organizational learning there, and he's been working on the Y2K, or year 2000, computer problem since the summer of 1997. So he very early on saw that this was something where some concerted research and study and evaluation was merited, and organized a research program around that. He's, with his various colleagues, he's conducted briefings for business, government, and association managers, arranged panel discussions, had a conference that I know of, at least one. I think he had both a before and an after conference, if I recall correctly. Operated a listserv on the subject and also constructed a website. So he has been extremely active throughout the entire process. And of course, he has also lectured widely on the Y2K issue in the U.S. and in various European countries. And he has assembled a group of people who have been closely involved and were close observers of what was going on. So without further ado, it's my special pleasure to introduce Stuart Umpleby.
Thank you very much, Peter. Okay. Well, my talk will be why the century date change went so smoothly. It wasn't always thought that it would go so smoothly. Here's just one cartoon indicating that people were startled by the possibilities that lay in store. Let me give you an overview of what I'm going to be saying, because I'm going to shift the focus of my presentation a few times. First, I'm going to say just a few brief remarks about why we should be interested in this, since not very much happened. Then I'll introduce the panelists, and then I'll make some connections to other presentations during the conference to help you see the relevance of this discussion. Then I'll go over briefly why people thought that disruptions might occur, and finally I'll give some reasons for why the rollover occurred so smoothly. Why should we be interested? Y2K became the largest technical project in human history. It's been called the largest management challenge since World War II. It was the largest example of peacetime cooperation in history, and work on Y2K was surprisingly successful. Now, the panelists that we have assembled to discuss the issues here today are Mark Haselkorn, who is a professor of technical journalism, I believe, technical communication at the University of Washington in Seattle, and he's also the director of a major study of Y2K that's being conducted by the National Academy of Sciences National Research Council and funded by various other government agencies. And also Olivia Bosch, who has a joint appointment between Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory in Livermore, California, and the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London. So she is a commuter on a global scale. Olivia organized 2 major conferences on Y2K, one in Seoul, Korea in October 1999, which brought together Y2K program managers of countries from around the world to deal with the issues that they thought they might not finish with and how they were planning to deal with those. And a second conference after the fact was held in Livermore, California in January 2000, and I'll also be saying a little bit about that. One of our, actually 2 of our other speakers won't be able to make it. Carl Mueller from Vienna, Austria, had to do a report for the European Union, and it went awry in the last moment, so he's very unhappy he couldn't make it, but I will present his remarks very briefly. And then Arne Collin, who was here earlier in the conference, was thinking the panel was earlier in the week and made plans to leave, and he wasn't able to change those, but that's a co-authored presentation with me, so I will go through that briefly as well. Now, we're planning to have discussion. That is, if there are any questions of a clarifying nature at the end of the presentation, please ask them. Then we'll go through the presentations, and then we'll have some questions to each other, and then we'll open it up to the floor. So since this will not be followed by a workshop or a dinner conversation, we plan to have the conversations here. I hope that procedure is clear. Okay. Okay, now let me make a few connections to other presentations. We had a panel discussion of forecasting. Y2K contained 2 major forecasting errors or failures. First, we didn't see it coming until really quite late, which led to increased costs. Second, we didn't fully anticipate the consequences. We did not have very good information on the social ramifications of possible technical failures or how many technical failures would occur. During the conference, there have been several presentations on global sustainability, population growth, natural resources, pollution, etc. Y2K offers a case study of how institutions and the public respond to global problems. So I think there's much we can learn from it. During the conference, a number of people have spoken about irreducible uncertainty and unavoidable surprises. Those 2 descriptions certainly characterize Y2K. And we can learn how people cope with uncertainty and surprises. There have been discussions of networking and self-organization. Y2K was an extraordinary example of effective networking and unprecedented societal self-organization. Also at the conference, many people have said that we ought to test our theories in practice, that we should be more engaged with society. Certainly Y2K has presented and continues to present opportunities to test our theories and methods of systems intervention. And then finally, one possible conclusion is that human beings are more adaptable, more resourceful, and better at managing our systems than current methods of analysis lead us to believe. Okay, so what was the issue about Y2K? I know that many people didn't just sort of decided the technical people will handle it and didn't pay much attention to it. So let me, for those of you who aren't terribly familiar with it, go over it very briefly. There were basically 2 dangers. One came from embedded systems, the other from office systems or IT systems. The embedded systems part of the problem was discovered later, only at about 1997. And this is the fact that not only were 2-digit dates encoded in office systems, databases, and so forth, but also in programmed logic controllers, in chips that regulate things from putting a date on your camera to your VCR to your coffee pot. But the most important things were the SCADA system. SCADA stands for Supervisory Control and Data Acquisition. These are load balancing systems. They exist in electric power networks, water supply systems, steel mills, chemical plants, nuclear plants, etc. They control flow and regulate flow. And the fear was that if those things went awry, major infrastructure could be lost. So that there could be multiple Bhopals or Chernobyls along with the loss of urban infrastructure. In the case of office systems, there were threats to the global economy. And in the case of government services, governments, it was feared, might not be able to collect taxes, benefits, salaries, contracts, which could lead to the failures of governments in terms of social acceptance. Was this hype, or was this real in any sense? Well, here's a report card that was issued by a House committee of the House of Representatives in the United States by Stephen Horn. He was the chairman of the committee in November 1998. It's a report card. Horn used to be a professor. In fact, I think he was a university professor, university president. And he graded the various agencies on their preparations for dealing with Y2K. And as you can see, several agencies got Fs. The Justice Department, that includes prisons, DOE, that includes nuclear reactors, Health and Human Services, Medicare and Medicaid, the State Department, USAID. DOD got a D-, and the Department of Transportation, which includes the Federal Aviation Administration, got a D. So things weren't going real well in November of '98. How are things going internationally? This is a study that was done by the Gartner Group. It's an information technology consulting firm. They surveyed corporations around the world, and they suggested that in the blue countries, which is basically the United States, Canada, Britain, Australia, 15% of corporations would experience at least one mission-critical system failure. In the yellow countries, 33% of corporations would experience at least one mission-critical system failure. In the orange countries, it's 50%, and in the red countries, it's 66% would experience at least one mission-critical system failure. So if you think in terms of networks operating, ask yourself the question, how many nodes need to go down before the whole thing goes down? And you can ask yourself, well, is it 66%, 50%, 33%, 15%? Judging from the Gartner Group data, we had the opportunity to find out. So it looked like a very exciting social experiment. They also classified various industries in terms of the industries in which 15% of the companies would experience at least one mission-critical system failure, and that included insurance, banking, services, pharmaceuticals. 33% would be heavy equipment, aerospace, etc. Some of you might be interested in education, healthcare, and government agencies. They were up to 66% would experience at least one mission-critical system failure. Okay, well, what did the experts think the social impact of these mission-critical system failures would be? That question was asked by Bruce Webster, who was the coordinator of a series of meetings in Washington, D.C., which were held at Fannie Mae. It's a mortgage company association. And they had brought together the people who were fixing the equipment from places like the Department of Defense, Department of Energy, the World Bank, the Bank of Maryland, etc., major organizations. And there you had a lecture series on how do you fix it, etc. And he surveyed them to find out, what do you think the social consequences will be? He created a scale going from 0 to 10, where 0 is no perceptible impact and 10 is general societal collapse. And as you can see, they were sort of normally distributed, indicating they thought the consequences would be reasonably severe. Well, this, of course, led to a good deal of public discussion. Here's a little cartoon. how individuals would preparing. It looks like the lady is stocking up and the gentleman has an assault rifle in the corner, and he says, "You think you've made plans for everything, and what do you end up with? A budget surplus and an area code shortage." In the case of institutions and how they were responding, this was a widely circulated cartoon which basically indicated that people weren't real confident about what they were being told by corporations. Corporations were saying everything's fine, we're ready. But the concern was that they might be saying that just to keep the stock price up and to not lose customers. Here's a drawing from the cover of an engineering magazine in Turkey, which I think very nicely captures the dual themes of self-infliction and denial. So as we approached the magic date of January 1st, 2000, corporations and governments were setting up command and control centers to monitor whatever disruptions might occur and to speed remedies as much as possible. This is the control center that was set up in Washington, D.C. To monitor what was happening around the world. So, as you all know, not much happened, at least not on January 1st. In fact, one senior government official was said to have said, January 1st was the best day ever for the world's infrastructure. No one knows why. So, as you can see, there were very few disruptions or glitches. This is based on press reports. But as January went on, the number of glitches reported increased. And as we got into February, they continued to increase, so that at the end of February, they reached a peak. And thereafter, the number of glitches seems to have leveled off and declined, and the data is no longer being collected. This was done by a private individual, by the way. Prior to January 1st, we had many sources of official information: the House, the Senate, the World Bank, the Gartner Group, the State Department, other countries. January 1st, all the data collection was shut down. So it's now being done by private individuals. So here's a comparison of what the Gartner Group expected and what actually happened. This came from the U.S. Senate. The Senate based a lot of its projections on the Gartner Group. Look at this diagram down here. As you can see, the Gartner Group expected disruptions to rise in 1999, peak in 2000, that they would happen throughout the year, then they would decline in 2001, etc. But what has actually happened is the little gray area underneath. That is, there have been a few disruptions in 99, and they did certainly rise in early 2000, but then they seemed to peak, and then they didn't continue the diagram. So that what actually happened is significantly less than what was anticipated. Okay, now the rest of my talk is going to be my interpretation of what happened at the conference that Olivia organized in January out at Livermore, California. I'll go over who was at the conference, what happened January 1st, was there really a problem, why was there so little disruption, why were there no problems in Italy, etc., and why were there concerns about Russia. I'll also deal with the question why Americans were not evacuated from overseas. This was widely discussed in Washington during the summer of '99. And then I'll hit common themes in the future. Who was at the conference? Well, the sponsors were Olivia's employers, the Center for Global Security Research at Lawrence Livermore National Lab and the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London. The participants were the heads of Y2K projects of several governments, international organizations, and large departments such as DoD and major corporations. There were very few civilians. I was one. What happened January 1st? There were surprisingly few noticeable failures. There were some power outages, but because electricity can be shared through the network, that was not noticeable. Quick fixes and workarounds prevented reportable failures. In order not to be overwhelmed with a large number of reports of minor impact, they set a cutoff for what was a reportable failure, and very few incidents exceeded the threshold of a reportable failure. The most affected equipment in decreasing in frequency was PCs, servers, mainframes, networks, the internet, security systems, and embedded chips. So embedded chips, which was a great concern, was not a major problem. A breakdown of the failures shows that 80% were insignificant, 16% caused brief service interruptions, 4% caused significant service interruptions. Okay, well, was there really a problem? Did we spend all that money for no reason? Percy Manguela, who was the head of the Informatics Working Group of the United Nations, said, "Some have interpreted success as vindication for earlier cynicism." Some people never believed in the problem. But, nevertheless, approximately 500 billion was spent worldwide to fix equipment. Approximately 100 billion was spent in the U.S., and approximately 10 billion was spent by the U.S. government. Another reason why people were concerned about the outcome of Y2K was that the budgets rose quite substantially during the period of remediation. For example, the federal government estimated it would spend 2.3 billion in 1997. That is, in 1997, they thought Y2K would cost 2.3 billion. In 1999, they estimated they would spend 8.3 billion, and they are now saying they probably spent over 10 billion. So that's approximately a factor of 5, and that's more than your usual cost overrun. In other words, when they began doing the assessments, the problem was greater than initially anticipated. Was there really a problem? During the California conference, Joe Wise from the Electric Power Research Institute was asked by a somewhat agitated member of the audience, "Why didn't you tell everybody that the electric power grid would work?" To which she replied, "We didn't know it would work. We thought it would work. We were pretty confident that it would work. We had done everything we could think of to make sure that it would work, but we weren't sure. We might have missed something." Similarly, John Boggs of the International Air Transportation Association said, "We were uncertain until the last moment." And Hewlett-Packard Agilent bought 60 Iridium telephones, which basically means they weren't sure the telephone grid would work. And command centers were set up by businesses and governments around the world. Why was there so little disruption? Many reasons have been offered. One of them has to do with the fact that there were only 6 to 8 vendors worldwide of some key embedded systems. Now, the reason embedded systems was a matter of such concern was that we never really had dealt with embedded systems before. We hadn't really thought of it as a problem until 1997, even though they'd been working on Y2K for several years. Nobody knew where they were. Nobody had an inventory of them, and nobody knew which ones were date sensitive and which ones were not. So all of that data had to be collected in terms of creating a list of automatic controllers, chips, etc., contacting the vendors, finding out whether they were date sensitive. You couldn't test them. You had to go to the vendors, and then you had to distribute that information. Fortunately, the information was distributed so that not everybody had to go through this, what was called the world's largest Easter egg hunt, to find these devices and then to determine which ones were date sensitive, and hence which ones had to be replaced. Furthermore, many systems had manual backups. And I think the reason for that is that a lot of these systems, you have to bring them up and take them down from time to time, so that even though while they're in operation they are controlled by chips and automatic controllers, the fact that you have to bring them up and take them down means that you have manual controls that operate in parallel. And many systems were switched over to manual control. That's why there were so few failures in early January, but there were failures later. At one point in the conference, someone said that many systems were shut down. That electric power consumption was only 1/3 of normal. So they just didn't have the opportunity to fail. And those that had to continue operation, they switched to manual control. When they switched back to automatic control, they failed. But that was several days later, and so you could spread the failures out in time and hence avoid multiple simultaneous failures. And then the early actors found where the problems were, particularly in embedded systems, and shared the information, although that's generally true. Email and the web were widely used by businesses, governments, and associations. The biggest surprise to me was to learn that international corporations had acted abroad as they did at home. That is, they fixed internal equipment and worked with suppliers, including utilities. Well, this is quite logical when you think about it, but the reports didn't say that. So that, for example, a person who ran a refinery in some country knows the refinery is not going to work if he doesn't have electricity and water and the transportation systems aren't functioning and so forth. So, and he may play golf with the guys that run these other operations, so he talks to them and he makes sure that they know about the problem, that they have the necessary information, and probably sends over some of his technical guys if their technical guys don't know what to do. So that the international corporations apparently were much more active than was generally known. Another point was that the money required for many companies was not large, less than 1% of operating budgets, sometimes less than 1/2 of 1% of operating budgets. What that means is you can go ahead and spend the money and figure out where to get it later. You don't have to run it up the chain of command, get a budget approval, explain what the problem is and why you need to spend the money, and so forth. You can just spend the money. In contrast, euro conversion is 3 to 6 times more expensive. That's not true in every case. Citibank, for example, I was told last year that they were going to spend $650 million on Y2K. I was just recently told they spent over $1 billion on Y2K. And there was a high-level management commitment and low IT penetration in many countries. There was also unprecedented cooperation among all affected organizations. Companies shared information with each other, companies that normally compete. Countries normally hostile to one another, such as the United States and Russia or India and Pakistan, cooperated and shared information. There was a recognition of a common threat due to economic interdependencies. So it was said that no one is ready unless everyone is ready. And they worked on critical sectors first, electric power and telecommunications. One of the greatest uncertainties is who will be better off as a result of Y2K. As I spoke in various countries on the issue, I was fascinated by the fact that everyone thought somebody else would be worse off. So that in the United States, people said, we've been working on it a long time, it's the other countries that'll have the problems. When I spoke in the less developed countries of Europe, like Slovenia and so forth, they said, the US may have a problem, but we don't have very many computers, so we won't have a problem. Everyone thought somebody else would have a bigger problem. Italy was used as an example of a country where problems were expected. The reason being, it's a fairly developed country and it started very late. Italy did not have a Y2K coordinator until December of 1998 at the time of the first UN meeting. He didn't have an office or a budget or a telephone for several months, and Italy held its first government-wide meeting on Y2K in either August or September. When he began calling around to find out if everyone was ready, he was told, yes, we're ready. So the news coming out of Italy is they don't have a coordinator, and a few months later, it's all been fixed. So there were doubts about the situation in Italy. Apparently, the explanation is the corporations were fixing the equipment, and they just didn't bother to tell the government. There were considerable concerns about Russia and Ukraine, particularly in the summer of 1999. nuclear weapons and automatic launches of missiles were not a problem because they require human intervention. And they set up this coordinating center in Colorado to make sure that there were not any accidental launches. The danger there was that an early warning system would go down. Somebody might think they were being attacked when they weren't and decide to launch their missiles rather than lose them. So they set up this coordinating center to make sure that didn't happen. By the way, the hotline between the White House and the Kremlin was not Y2K compliant until it was fixed. Also, the Federal Emergency Management Agency in the United States, which has the responsibility to coordinate the response to disasters of 23 federal agencies, their telephone system was not Y2K compliant until it was fixed. The reason for the concern in Russia and Ukraine was that there were problems with the nuclear reactor monitoring systems. And if you can't monitor a nuclear reactor, the standard procedure is to shut it down. That creates a problem because a nuclear reactor remains hot for not only months but years after it's shut down. So you have to keep circulating the water. But to circulate the water requires energy. And that means you have to get energy from the electric power grid, the fossil fuel plants, in order to cool the nuclear reactors. But there wasn't enough electric power to both cool the nuclear reactors and supply the civilian population. So the decision was to use the available electric power to cool the nuclear reactors, which is the right decision in terms of the long-term environment, but it means that the civilian population might be without electric power in January, February, and March, which is not balmy in Russia and Ukraine. And there were problems with the automatic systems of the fossil fuel plants in Russia and Ukraine. However, they could be switched to manual operation, and they were. However, everybody who had worked with Russia and Ukraine on their energy systems was surprised that there were no disruptions in January. Okay, the evacuation dilemma. I'm just about done. The concern was that other countries would experience significant disruptions. The State Department has responsibility for ensuring the protection of American citizens abroad, students, business people, embassy employees, and so forth. The question was, should we preposition supplies like generators, water, food, whatever, and should we evacuate some personnel? If so, that would be a logistical problem of considerable scope. It would be very expensive, so you need very good information about where to put your supplies and where to evacuate your people. So they developed, also there would be political implications. If all the Americans leave, what do the locals think? So they developed an information system with 3 sources of information. First, they got together and developed an interagency working groups consisting of people from state, defense, USAID, commerce, etc., to share information so that not everybody would be going out talking to people in the hospitals and the electric plants and so forth. Second, they talked to the international organizations to ask them, you know, is this nuclear reactor safe? How are these people doing on the electric power grid? And then finally, in the fall of 1999, somebody had a bright idea. And that was that the multinational corporations down the street from the embassy or the military base didn't seem to be very concerned. So they went down and asked the people in the multinational corporations, how have you assessed the local situation in terms of Y2K? And their reply was, we've been working with the local people, we think they're okay. So the decision in the Pentagon was to follow the money. That is, to rely upon the reports from the multinational corporations. The word was that it would be a smooth rollover. So why did the good news not get out? Well, Bruce McConnell, who ran the International Y2K Coordinating Center, said when he asked journalists that question, good news is no news. In other words, the fact that the world's infrastructure won't collapse was not really news because normally it doesn't. so it wasn't reported. It did have the effect of stopping articles of a doomsday nature that some journalists were writing. But since the official word was it will be a smooth rollover, those articles were not published, but statements that it would be a smooth rollover did not get into the press as much as might have been the case. Also, a lot of people didn't believe the reports from corporations because the corporations just said, well, we're ready, but they didn't provide a lot of details to resolve the doubts. There were fear of lawsuits which blocked claims of complete compliance. Let me explain that. If a corporation says we won't have a problem, and then it turns out that they do have a problem because of some little embedded chip, then maybe they're liable for making a false representation to a customer or a supplier. So better to waffle on the thing. And the lawyers played a major role in this in a number of respects. I think I'll stop there and let Mark and Olivia take over. Are there any clarifying questions? Okay, then our next speaker is Mark Haselkorn. You want me to do yours?
Yeah, why don't you do those and I'll go up and
Okay.
Hi. Can everybody hear me? Hi. I'm Mark Haselkorn. I'm going to talk about lessons from Y2K for strategic management of IT. What I'm really going to talk about, I think one of the themes is for you guys, is that because it wasn't catastrophic, it's actually of much greater interest to you. If it was a simple domino effect, this fails, this fails, this fails, and everything goes, that would have been a very uninteresting system. Complex systems aren't like that. You know that complex systems have all kinds of interesting facets and redundancies, and as a study of complexity, it's much richer because it wasn't catastrophic, and I hope you'll see that from this presentation. But one thing Y2K did do was it stressed everybody's management system for IT, and I'm using IT in the broadest sense. That's everything that a given organization does to use information and information technology to achieve their goals. It's not just wires, but machines and operating systems and applications and data structures and practices and everything. The whole ball of wax. Okay. And not to play one-upsmanship, but I started studying Y2K in early February '95, and from '97 to '98 I was Y2K coordinator for the National Science Foundation, which you'll notice had an A next to it. Probably you didn't. And this title for this study is it was probably more than 2.5 years old. That's what we thought we were studying when the National Research Council decided to put together a project, a before and after Y2K project, when we said, oh, this is an opportunity to learn something. We better do some things before January 1st so that then we can repeat them afterwards and see if things changed. Because our major client is the Department of Defense, the focus is naturally on very large, very diverse, global kinds of organizations, but that turned out to be very interesting. And finally, a little caveat here that the way the Research Council works, I'm not allowed to give you definitive conclusions. Things go through review, et cetera, as you know. So probably I'm going to try to be more descriptive than judgmental, but I sometimes have trouble doing that. So if you hear me starting to make judgmental statements, ignore them. I'm just being descriptive today, okay? That's all. So what I will do, if we could go to the next one, is I'll talk about very briefly how Y2K changed, then briefly how the problem we were studying changed, and then I'll make some initial observations that I'll group under 3 areas: managing complexity, aligning with the organization, and minimizing risk. and risk and response issues. And then I'll tell you some of the things we're working on right now. Okay. So how did Y2K change? Remember, this was a process. For most organizations, whether it was visible to everybody, it was probably at least a 5-year, if not longer, process. From the time somebody said, gee, we have a problem, to some large organization and some large system coming up with an evolving response to this thing. It's very interesting just from that perspective, of course. One of the processes that was already mentioned by Stuart was this shift from it being about dates in software and how that impacted IT systems to being about embedded chips. That is anything with a date in it. Sprinklers, alarm systems, security systems, Jeeps. You name it. It really was what it really was a shift from a focus solely on the new infrastructure, that is the IT infrastructure, to the old infrastructure, to the traditional infrastructure, to power and you know, transportation and all the traditional civil engineering stuff. That's a major shift. Along with that, in some sense, almost an opposite thing, because that sounds like a push into the machine, right, into technology. I'm going to skip the second one, go to the third one. Along with that was a shift from a focus on technology, particularly IT technology, to mission, to it being an operational problem, to it not being about machines, but rather being about what we do and assuring that we can continue to accomplish what we do. That's a funny combination there. You know, first you say on the first, and the first one you sort of say it's about everything, anything with a date in it. And in the second one you're saying you're saying it's about everything we do. It's about our mission. Clearly, by the time you said those two things, it was not fixable. That was just too big a project. So then the accompanying shift that followed was from let's fix it to let's make sure we've got continuity plans. Let's make sure we're prepared to manage consequences. And finally, there was this was a shift. Certainly initially it was noticed as technology, but most people probably didn't notice it that way. A very small group of folks noticed that. For most people, probably initially, the first time it came to their attention, it was as a political problem or a legal problem. If you worked in government, probably that report card that Stuart showed you was the impetus that got you involved. It was a political pressure, not a technology problem. There were other shifts, but again, I'm trying to be descriptive here. I'll let you put it together and see what happens. But there were lots of things changing as we went along. Let me put on my glasses, make sure I'm not forgetting something I wrote down here. I'll give you, let's see. I was going to mention zero tolerance here, but we'll get to that later. I'll tell you one really quick story on the software to chips thing that shows how it really was just made into an impossible problem. The power system folks did a test, EPRI did a test, and there was a failure. This was early on, they were just testing things, and the item that failed had been declared Y2K compliant for a very good reason. It had absolutely no date component. How could something fail that didn't have a date component and be Y2K? Well, it turns out it didn't have a date component, but it did have addressable memory. You could write something to it. And somebody, once it had been stuck into the system, had written something to it that had a date component to it. So, you know, the problem became everything. It really did. Once you stuck something into a system, it was out of your control. Nobody could ever say there was no possibility of something happening. Now, that's an interesting situation, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. This issue of tolerance for risk in Y2K, and why was it different than everything else? I mean, we're talking about IT, folks. Things fail all the time. That's the state of affairs. What was so different about this? Okay. Now, the problem we were studying changed, as I said before, so I won't spend too much time on it, because it got richer. It got richer when it wasn't catastrophic. It went from a focus on these sort of like fundamental flaws and cascading effects to really everything that goes into how we handle IT. It was about maintenance. It was about modernization. It was about how people designed and developed and implemented and used and maintained their systems. It was about interdependency and continuity, guidance policy, certification, who owned what, who was responsible for what, who needed to know what kind of jobs do we need to have, what's the impact, what about security and information assurance. It was just everything. It's really so incredibly rich. It's so much fun to work on, I got to tell you. Okay, let's go to the next one. You know, actually, I just want to get to this early, even though we could get to it later. I mean, robustness, in many ways, is so much more interesting than vulnerability. Really. You know, when you work for the military, you get an interesting perspective because you're on the side of folks who often are in the position of trying to break critical systems and critical infrastructure. And when, you know, those of us who generally try to maintain them think they're really vulnerable. But when you're in the perspective of having to break them, they turn out to be not so easy to break. You know, in World War II, you go and you bomb a whole lot of cities' infrastructures and you think you're going to bring Europe to its knees or something, and it doesn't happen. It's not so easy. So robustness is at least as interesting as vulnerability. Okay, so some observations. Certainly there was difficulty from just the pervasiveness of IT. It's everywhere. Everybody's got it on their desk. Everybody uses it. You can get tasked so many ways in the IT world. That's an interesting whole set of problems. You know, I'm not going to go into details on most of these. I could read you some quotes that people say. I won't do that. By the way, in between pervasiveness and dynamic should be diversity too. It's not just that it's everywhere, it's that everybody's using it for different stuff. It means different things to different people. And because it's everywhere, everyone feels they should have a say in it. And it's constantly, you know, changing in so many ways. You know, one of the issues is if you're going to do Y2K and you're going to make changes to things, then you got to try to put out patches, and you're going to try to standardize, and you're going to try to get everything, you know, you're going to try to freeze configurations, and once you decide they're compliant, how do you manage that huge effort of trying to get everything to a point where you're happy with it? You know, it turns out to be almost impossible because the machine you buy today is different than the machine you bought last year. And every PC's got, you know, there are 1,500 to 3,500 files in there that determine its configuration that are different on every machine. And if you made them all the same, they wouldn't work. It's the nature of the industry. It's changing constantly. It's different all the time. It's just not possible. There was a case where they were trying to standardize an IBM system, and in the time it took for them to freeze everything and get it set, there had been 150 releases that they hadn't implemented. And interestingly then, IBM came along and said, sorry, we can't declare you Y2K till you put in all those 150 new releases. So it's just impossible. The system of systems issue, that is, rather than, most people are in a functional job, and there is a functional perspective to what they do, and so they see the large system from a particular perspective, and they can address it from that perspective. But to address it as the larger system of systems was just so hard that most organizations said, we're going to ignore that and declare victory on the stuff that we can do. And then, this is maybe the most interesting one. There were people with the knowledge to stratify the response, to say that this was really very low probability, or this was something we better worry about, or this was low probability, low impact even. You know, all the various ways you might do risk management. But for a number of reasons, some of which I'll get to, that was impossible to do. It was treated as a generic problem, not a specific threat, a generic threat. Everything was treated equally, by and large. Okay. In fact, I'll tell you a story of a let's see, what's on here? Oh, good, I'll get to it. I'll put it under higher levels of oversight. Okay, now, organizations, the way this played out in organizations is really fascinating. Some of this you would expect. Ownership and responsibility were really interesting because you got this pervasive thing and it's a system of systems. Normally people like to own things. But of course, in this case, ownership often carried with it the responsibility to do something. So in this case, a lot of people didn't like to own things for the first time, because usually resources go with what you own. In this case, responsibility, often without resources, went with what you own. But it was fascinating that for the first time, a lot of folks had to sit there and take this very interconnected system and say, ooh, well, I'll take ownership up to this button, but you take the wires, and you know, it forced organizations to look at things in a way they hadn't looked at before. And the continuity plans forced that as well, because with the continuity plans, usual continuity plans were if I go down, I go over to Joe. But now for the first time, you had to say, what if we all go down at once? That was a little twist as well. So there was a lot of lack of clarity about ownership, responsibility. Guidance came from everywhere. People were getting multiple guidance, multiple checks. It was very difficult in the time there was to establish a very coherent policy guidance system. Special groups were set up generally. Now that's interesting. Why were why have Koskinen's committee? Why have the military Y2K office? Why have the International Cooperation Center for the UN? What was wrong with the current structure? What was missing that everybody had to go around set up special organizations? Or did they? And one thing that happened was there was an awful lot of cross-functional matrixing, especially within organizations at lower levels than they had happened before. Worker bee, there was always high-level matrixing, but worker bee matrixing occurred. That was very interesting and often very successful. But there's been a return to business as usual, definitely. There's a lot of interesting interplay between central standards and guidance and that effort to freeze things and to have control of things versus local flexibility and execution. Under higher levels of oversight, once you made this into a mission problem, then you got people who are saying, oh, this is about what we do. It's not about that technology, so I have to have a say. That had good and bad sides to it. It's really good to get your higher level administration to realize how IT is integrated in your function. That's key to aligning things. It's not so good to all the layers you suddenly have to go through to get anything done, and suddenly having to try to explain something to someone who just doesn't understand. That definitely impacted the failure of stratification, because what you got, one story was, okay, so you freeze this program, you freeze all your programs, you say they're Y2K compliant, you got to go through a big certification process if you're going to make any changes. And you walk in and you say, I need to make a change. It's a 500,000 line program, I need to change one line. And it's not going to, and the new higher up person who has to worry about this thing says, well, is there any chance this is going to cause a Y2K problem? And you say, well, you know, you got to know the nature of software. Of course there's a chance, you know, but this could happen, this could happen, this could happen, this could happen. This has this percent of probability, this has this probability. And even if I'm 50% underestimating the probability, it still has about as much chance as the sun not rising tomorrow. That's an actual quote from a story. And the higher up, who doesn't understand what you just said anyway, and who now suddenly has their butt on the line, says, go through the week of recertification, you have to do it. Because we're just going to treat this, if there's any chance, we're just going to treat it this way. You know, this zero risk policy was very interesting. Why for Y2K did we have a zero risk policy? Funding issues, there's lots of them. One is that one thing Y2K did do was all the publicity and all the attention actually got at some special funding in a lot of organizations so that you could fund these special groups in the cross-matricing activities. Now that it's over, that funding's gone away and we're going back to stovepipes. How do you fund these cross-matrix activities is a difficult question. And training, job positions, you know, it's one thing to say, I'm going to push this out and we're going to have standard systems and we're going to be able to manage them rationally. But there's an infrastructure that's necessary for that. People have to be on the job who understand what you're doing. You have to not only fund the thing you're pushing out, but you have to fund, and you not only have to fund the bandwidth, and you not only have to fund the hardware, but you have to fund the people. You have to have the right people in the right places, and you have to have training, and that's tough too. Okay, sorry that took so long. I'll go quicker. 2 more slides. Okay, risk. As I said, things fail all the time. Why? What was different about this? Was it that it had a deadline, that it had a date you could attach to it? Was it that everybody thought it would hit everybody at once as opposed to local problems? I mean, you can think about that. What was there about this? Was it a lack of understanding? Was it people just faced with uncertainty and not understanding the problem? And is that how we react? But there was a lower tolerance for risk. Every time you release new software, you screw things up. That's life. That's the IT world. People know that. So here you had these managers who do that all the time, and they know there's more risk every time they do their job than this special issue, and yet they were being told, no, you have to be tougher on this one. Systems have considerable redundancy. And, you know, redundancy often from a technical standpoint is thought of as a bad thing. You know, it's wasteful. Why do we have more than one thing? But when you think of IT in an organization as an ecology, as is the latest popular thing, the whole notion of information ecology, well, in ecologies, redundancy is good. Redundancy is a hallmark of successful species. Maybe we're looking at it wrong, and maybe all of that is a good way to go. Maybe we like redundancy. But there is a growing reliance. While maybe we weren't as reliant as some people thought, and that may have a factor, we are relying more and more. I mean, there was just an article in the paper, you know, what about this weapon system they're testing right now? There was an article in the paper that it's going to take the president out of the loop or whatever. Well, maybe it will, maybe it won't. But the point is, we are moving to systems where decisions are being made based on the data coming out of a machine, more and more. That is a fact. Operational risk management in most organizations comes out of the safety function. And it never got hooked up with Y2K for most organizations. And that's strange. I mean, it seems like the whole thing was a risk management activity. Yet that didn't seem to play a role. Continuity plans, critical, and not just for Y2K, for security, for information assurance. Lot of lessons about continuity plans. You can't just, you know, oh, let's pull out this continuity plan today and use it. It turns out you have to be revising your continuity plans constantly. If you're not exercising your continuity plans constantly, then you're in trouble. Then it's not going to work because it's a dynamic, environment. What's happened, incredible amounts of information, very valuable information were generated during Y2K about what you have, about how they interrelate, about, about continuity plans. All of that information is already out of date, and the commitment is not there, the funding is not there to maintain it. So this multi-billion dollar worldwide effort produced an awful lot of useful stuff, and it's already down the tubes. Security and information flow. The whole thing about the new information infrastructure in IT is to get information flowing all over the place and get people taking a piece of information here and a piece of information there and putting it together and making exciting things happen. How do you maintain that kind of environment when you're trying to also protect your secrets, when you're trying to be secure, when you're trying to avoid denial of services attacks, whatever? That's a tough one. And there are a lot of lessons from Y2K that we don't have time for. So, last slide. Some of the things we're working on right now. Most of them are obvious from the talk so far. Some clearer understanding of why Y2K was different. More understanding of the appropriateness of the response, not just quantitative, that is, was the dollar threat equivalent to the dollar spent, but even more interestingly, qualitatively, did what was done actually touch the risk? Or was it just done and things would have happened anyway? It's entirely possible that the real loss, which maybe can't be measured, was what didn't get done. All those things that people would have been doing if they hadn't been spending that week getting that thing certified that they never had to do in the first place. That may be the real loss that's not measured. Yeah, we really need to understand system robustness. I mean, the hype was that it was really vulnerable. The hype was that these things were incredibly sensitive. You hear that hype all the time. Is that really true? Hidden impacts, in many cases solutions have introduced future problems. In many cases the actual, it hasn't been exercised yet. Some future calculation hasn't been conducted yet. Applications to information assurance and security, I don't know if Olivia's going to talk more about that. Y2K was an unintentional problem. It was a systemic problem at its most difficult. Nobody was trying to hurt you. It was a feature of interconnectedness. It's a feature of globalization. When the United States decides to link systems with Venezuela to facilitate the flow of oil, we're putting ourselves in a shared risk position. They might do something unintentionally that hurts us. We might do something unintentionally that hurts them. That's the world. That's unintentional. But if we are not good at managing systemic complexity, we're at risk. Security is intentional. Somebody's out there trying to hurt your functionality. In one sense, they're almost the opposite. One is a cost of functionality. The other is an attack against your functionality. But if you don't do both, and if you don't integrate both, then you're not truly safe. And it turns out there's a lot of applications across the two as well. So that's a whole nother very interesting area of investigation. That's about it. I hope that wasn't too random. Thank you very much. I would only speak to the ones that got publicity anyway. There was obviously that spy satellite that got most of the publicity. And the interesting thing about that one was they couldn't, the system, this is a good complexity lesson, the system was too complex, they couldn't test it without bringing it down. And the time it would have taken to bring it down and test it was about the same as the time it went down afterwards. So it was 6 of one and half a dozen of the other. You lost it earlier or you lost it later, so you might as well take a chance. No. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Maybe a lot of people don't perceive this.
Well, I don't know if this is large enough to truly answer your question, but one thing that came to my mind when you were asking it was we kept hearing, you know, there had been this very good stuff done, huge inventory generated, let's say, and believe it or not, knowing what you have is important. For instance, how could you do security? How could you protect something if you didn't know what you were protecting? But as I said, it's dynamic. You lose it right away. Well, one reason it gets lost right away is because nobody finds a use for it. And there's a real cost in time and commitment and to maintaining it. Someone's got to have a reason to maintain these things. And so it seems like you have this emergency, everybody gets going, but then when you're done, maybe it's just human nature, we don't say, gee, I just spent $200 billion, maybe I ought to learn something from it, maybe there's something useful to salvage here. It's almost as if we just say, oh, okay, we're done. Unless you find a use, unless as you're creating this stuff, you're also thinking long term and saying, we're going to use this for something, then there's going to be no incentive to keep it going. That's the one thing that I heard a lot that came into mind when you asked that. I don't know if that answers your question.
Just to kind of piggyback off of that, I would suggest that Y2K was not solved systematically in the sense that, for instance, I heard it quoted this way, that a corporate global executive, that if everybody does their piece, nobody will fail. So it was still a reductionist. Yeah, they were connected in their organization, and yeah, they verified that the company that sold them goods did their job, but truly, I don't really think the way that we mean systems that was applied. I really don't. Second comment on your investment, I think you're right on the money. I think the billions of dollars that people say they quote spent, really they would have spent a large portion of that they would have spent anyhow. And those companies that really maybe bumped their inventory up for supplies during that period spent down, so at the end of the year, it really wasn't an overreach. So I think you're right on the money.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and on your first comment, I would say that if by that you mean we didn't really address the system of systems problem, we really didn't, we addressed a problem at the nodes when the largest problem was at the links. But it was politically, it was just too difficult. And that's why you went to continuity and contingency plans. Now, the fact that there weren't greater catastrophic failures, that's where you start getting into this issue of, gee, maybe we don't rely on these things so much, or maybe we have a lot of redundancy, or maybe these things are more robust than we think they are. That becomes part of the mix too. There's a lot of issues here, and it's very complex.
We'll go on with Olivia's presentation, and then we'll have a general discussion.
Welcome. During my talk, I might insert a few comments that I have on some of the things that Stuart and Mark have talked about. So you see me scribbling away there, saying where I disagree, or yes, that's very good. So I interject them now and therefore I won't have anything to say over the discussion period afterwards. That's my introduction there. Stuart, you want to go to the next one? We know that. The main project was to look at implications for information infrastructure security. And Y2K was an opportunity to conduct an experiment to see what lessons might be learned that we could apply. And so through the year 2000 issue, we hope to determine vulnerabilities of threats to information, of both vulnerabilities of and threats to information networks and critical infrastructure, and whether or not they would affect international security, both in the traditional defense aspects as well as at the economic level. Secondly, we were trying to assess approaches to Y2K and security issues in different countries and compare how different countries were approaching that with what in fact did happen at the end or did not happen as a result of Y2K on the 31st December rollover. And thirdly, apply the lessons for other IT issues, in particular protection of our information networks and critical infrastructure. I could say that the I Love You virus is the closest to what I would have thought of what we expected to have happened from Y2K in terms of its global impact and at least the inconvenience that was caused. Okay. Focusing on infrastructure, we looked partly to narrow the scope of the project to have some kind of defined area. We looked basically at energy and communications. Without these, nothing else much works. Our emergency services, government operations, financial services, our industries, etc., all rely on those two particular pieces of infrastructure. Now, other organizations might include some of those as part of their definition, and I don't really disagree, but I think I had to look at two core basic issues. These also, sorry, 1 second, both the energy and communications sectors also represent two different kinds of problems that we might expect to go wrong. And in the energy sector, we see where there actually was a lot of redundancy and not as much interdependency as we expected, and having those kind of embedded chip systems, which if they failed would occur on 31st of December, and that's it. I simplify, but to make the point. And the communications were to reflect the kind of problem where you have a glitch here and you have a problem that cascades throughout a networked systems. Okay. Expectations in 1999 in terms of the my project, and I gave a talk in March of 1999 to a NATO Partnership for Peace seminar at which there were emergency service operators from all the countries in Europe and also the United States. And I put forward what I thought was going to happen. This was in March of 1999, based on country types. And I split it down into 3 countries. Advanced, more information technology dependent countries would be the most affected by just simply because they had the most computer and communications type systems. However, these effects would be mitigated because in the U.S. or Western oriented advanced countries, there tend to be emergency services which are better funded. Then the middle range developing countries, I argued, would be affected sporadically. Most likely in government-owned systems, partly because in many third-world countries, the governments have the main computers, and they're also the owner of also the owners of the infrastructure. Egypt, for instance, 80% of the computers that Egypt have are government-owned. Not unlike the United States, close call, but I believe the U.S. federal government has one of the largest numbers of computers as an entity. But here, unlike in the first category, if there were to be severe effects or severe disruptions, then they may be worse off because the emergency services are not very well funded if they have much of those services to begin with. And significantly, many minor Y2K glitches would probably be seen as part of normal disruption or inefficiency which occurs on a daily basis. And the third category were the least developed countries. They would be the least affected simply because they didn't have many computer systems and were not very well interconnected. Now, if I hold on for 1 second, Stuart. Stuart mentioned partly in November 1998, the Department of Defense had an F. One counter argument I heard is that the Department of Defense probably also has the most number of computers in the federal government, perhaps not too far off from social services and health. And therefore, they had many more to go through. Secondly, the Gartner Group reports their mechanism early on. They were the only game in town. They were the only ones that are actually going through trying to find out what was going on worldwide. However, towards the end of 1999, they became less credible in what was going on, partly because more sources of information were available. And thirdly, Bruce Webster's survey of the impact of scale from 1 to 10, 1 being not much happening and 10 being disaster, while that is a very good way to try to evaluate, I would say that I would have wanted a scale that somehow, or a model that could show that you could have like a number 9, a near catastrophic event happening in an overall kind of 1 condition. So that while he had a very good scale, it didn't necessarily reflect the kind of impact that emergency services personnel were expecting. Okay. Motivations for remediation. The main actors that I looked at were governments, industry, and international governmental organizations, and these were the reasons why they were focusing on Y2K remediation. Governments were concerned about public order and continuity. One of the main international setups to try to promote that was the International Y2K Cooperation Center, which came out of the United Nations, the UN Working Group on Informatics, along with the World Bank, helped set that up, which was up and running by February of 1999. Industry, I go to that. Perhaps director liability was the driver there. CEOs were very concerned about what they might have to do if they did not try to do all the best they could on that. They were concerned for the reputation of their company because that could ruin profit margins. And of course, business continuity was a way to ensure those or against possible disruptions. Thirdly, where I disagree with, maybe I misheard what Mark was talking about, safety actually was a crucial concern, and this was partly promoted through the international governmental organizations. You have, for instance, the International Civil Aviation Organization. Its #1 concern is to make sure that our airplanes and air industry is flying safely. Same with the International Atomic Energy Agency, quite concerned that the nuclear power plants around the world were working safely. The World Association of Nuclear Operators, in fact, had done a lot more work than the IAEA, or at least they'd done earlier work towards the end of 1998 in trying to make sure that nuclear power plant operators were up to speed. And the International Telecommunications Union in Geneva, they had test after test. They had all the international, most of the international carriers and country carriers were soon on board, and they even resorted to naming names of countries that hadn't said whether or not they were compliant. So these international governmental organizations were actually quite crucial in making sure that at least safety, there were other issues, but safety was being represented and dealt with. And Stuart mentioned the conference we had in Korea and in January, and it was these representatives that we invited. We didn't have as many civilians, partly because we were not looking at what local communities were doing, what the individual was doing to deal with Y2K. This was in no way a reflection of of saying they weren't important. Our project was looking at how do you protect critical information, infrastructure, and those kinds of issues. They tend to be functions that governments have in terms of public interest, population safety, and the security of a country, and infrastructure is core to that. Okay. Y2K impact. Clearly, there was a Y2K problem, even actually before December 31st, 1999. Even the United Kingdom, in the week before, a lot of credit card readers, thousands of credit card readers didn't work in that week before. Many insurance companies, travel agencies would have had an experience of a Y2K failure during 1999 because they have particular functions and jobs which require booking into the next century. So they had to deal with a lot of these events before 31st December 1999. No major catastrophic events, but many small incidents. I think everyone pretty much agrees on that. Reflection or commenting on the question to Mark about security incidents. The major one is both the U.S. and the French surveillance and communication satellites having failed. We did have Deputy Secretary of Defense John Hamre come to our conference in January. He was a keynote speaker there. And after he said hello and glad to be here, the first thing he talked about was that event. So clearly he wanted to get that one out of the way in the discussion. But he did comment, and Mark was commenting, that it was difficult to do the testing earlier. He did mention that if it was partly to do with the shifting the antennas around. So even if they had done a test, let's say during 1999, the satellites would be in a different position in the sky by 31st of December, so that there wouldn't be an accurate end-to-end testing, if you can call it that. So it was an end-to-end testing kind of issue. He did say, however, that backup systems came up within 2 hours and 7 minutes after the system was reported to have been, when they knew the system had gone down. And they were working at about just over 50% of capacity, but that was sufficient in order to deal with what they were dealing with, though he did not say what they were dealing with. Underreporting. Stuart went through quite a bit on that. Underreporting because there were categories of what would be considered a reportable incident. The best and the brightest were on duty that night, so they were fixing things as they happened or mitigated them from becoming very serious and therefore not reported. And the best and the brightest were on duty, and in some cases, in some developing countries, the electricity system actually was working much better than it ever had, because the best and brightest were on duty. So while everyone's focusing on doom and gloom, there were some interesting, very interesting counter examples. Real life continues to surprise us, and I don't know that anyone was expecting that to happen. I had never heard of that before, and that was good to hear. Okay. And why I say on that underreporting, temporary fixes was important on that. They would fix it, and you will recall that everyone was focusing on critical mission systems, right? What happened to all those uncritical mission systems? Okay, they had to be fixed at some point. So it is not unreasonable to expect the kind of graph that Stuart had shown, where you had all these glitches occurring in January and February, because I would expect that to be the glitches of the systems that weren't fixed. But because they weren't critical, again, they didn't reach the press, and people got on doing and fixing things in whatever way they had set up. And usually, well, that's what I'm going to say on that. Contribution to what already Stuart and Mark have said as to why there weren't as many glitches as we expected, and I was very surprised myself. I did expect a little bit more to happen on this. Clearly, there were high levels of government-industry cooperation to manage the problem. This also meant taking the precautionary measures of turning off systems. A lot of computer systems were turned off because there was concern about hackers and perhaps some other malicious activity occurring. And in fact, according to some of the computer incident response teams and those intrusion detection specialists, that in fact the level of activity was much lower than what they would have on a normal day. So, and the joke is, well, clearly hackers must enjoy a party now and again, and they're not necessarily all nerds and geeks all the time. And as Stuart mentioned, a lot of systems, other kinds of systems turned off and resort to manual controls. That all these precautionary systems measures were taken. Industry's global interest resulted in spread of best practices. This was perhaps the most unreported and probably least known efforts, as Stuart had already mentioned. Also, there were only a handful or two handfuls of vendors and makers of power plant and equipment. So they can get together and they do all the research on what needs doing, and then they spread the word around. And in part, and the same goes with the telecommunication systems. I should mention, and it wasn't very, I don't know how well known it is, but Y2K was never a problem for telephones at the level of basic switches. So there was no way that when you pick up the telephone call and you dialed that you couldn't get through because of a date in the switching problem. Okay, where the telephones were a problem were in two areas. One, congestion, okay, which is not a Y2K problem, but the companies are used to dealing with load, and after, as you go across the time zones, in the first 5-10 minutes, every country just about, I'm simplifying, but said they had a congestion on the telephone systems, and then it was recovered. Okay, but it wasn't a Y2K technical failure. And then the other, having said it, that the telecommunication don't have a problem at the switch level, where the problem was and expected were all the functions that we put and use our telecommunications systems to use. So whenever telecommunications are used to trigger telecontrols of other kinds of process systems, billing systems, metering systems, at that level is where a lot of work needed to be done to make sure that time stamps were done. But these were not critical mission systems or processes as much as the core processes of making sure we got electricity and that you could get your communications going through. And of course, there was a lot of redundancy, as Mark had mentioned as well. The other developing world, we all expected that they have lower levels of automation, but what came here is a reflection of my previous statements that they actually benefited from what was called leapfrogging. A lot of the, as I said, the vendors and the makers of the electricity plants and telecoms in the West had done a lot of research. A lot of Western researchers, Mark and all, no doubt must have done a lot of consulting. People paid for a lot of work and research to be done, and that kind of information was spread to developing countries, so they didn't have to pay for all that upfront work. So they got the information, and then they would take it and go, and they would know where to pretty much to look for. And the other issue, as I've mentioned at the beginning, developing countries, a lot of their infrastructure still is owned by government. So once the governments of many of these countries heard the word that they have to look at Y2K, they would send out like an all points bulletin and make sure it got all fixed and looked at. And so that facilitated or rather minimized the number of disruptions in developing countries. Comment on the costs involved. You know, what was the breakdown of that cost? And one can see why there might have been a rise in the costs from early in the mid 1990s to billions later on. You know, was the cost on hardware and software, repairs, you know, the labor that went into it? How much of it was buying new technology, which one of the audience members mentioned was pretty much a standard practice for a lot of companies to do that. And how much of the cost was in contingency planning? Because once the CEOs realized that they wouldn't be able to fix everything, they had to build into their business continuity plans, hiring more manual labor over the new year in order to do things manually, or have more secretarial and administrative staff, you know, to write out paychecks just in case the machines didn't work. Okay, so in effect, and this is partly an equation that arises too from a background I have partly in arms control negotiations. These main actors of governments, industry, and international organizations, in effect, were elites, money, and good management practices, which if you apply them all together, they can actually do a quick job when needed. Okay. So Y2K, as I said, this was an experiment. It was seen as a surrogate threat to critical infrastructure. On the one hand, it was very simple. It was a very narrow technical specifications problem. Okay? In that sense, it's one of any type of more than 2,000 kinds of vulnerabilities that are lurking out there. You know, one out of 2,000, it's not very good, not representative sample of what might go wrong. And as Mark mentioned, however, it was also a very complex issue because it affected all kinds of levels of society and all types of systems. So in what way were the Y2K similar to other threats to infrastructure? While it was a narrow technical specifications problem, in terms of its impact, it was studied as potentially having a crippling effect. And therefore, the emergency services were working very hard and overtime because in the end, any incident that did occur, it was local. And who fixes it at the local level? It's the engineer running the plant, and then you have your police and fire who are on standby to deal with anything that occurs untoward after that. And I would argue that in terms of the so-called corporate memory of Y2K for future, it will be in the emergency services who will add Y2K to their list of experience of incidents, with a caveat that they have to learn a little bit more about computers. It was compared to natural disasters. This was particularly noted in John Koskinen's announcements, and everyone was told to prepare for about 3 days outage as a result of a bad storm. Worst case scenario for business continuity planning. It was seen as a worst case scenario. So businesses had to think, what's the worst thing that could go wrong to my business? So information technology was elevated out of the back room, out of the geek corner, up into the boardroom where IT and the information systems were better placed. CEOs had a better knowledge of how IT fit into their business functions. And also, similar to other threats to the infrastructure, it was perhaps more on how you approach it, but there is great debate between risk management and risk avoidance. Departments of defense tend to be focusing on risk avoidance. National security is often seen as risk avoidance, but the Department of Defense, for instance, is now thinking about risk management, and partly in terms of information technology security. There's a recognition that it is impossible to protect your systems from every single kind of bugaboo out there. And it's even more difficult because more than 50, and some argue 60% of the glitches that occur are not the result of hackers, which get all the attention in the press, but are a result of human error, misimplementation of technology policies, improper computer configuration in your system. So it's very difficult to determine whether something immediately is a hacker or someone with malicious intent, or just a breakdown in your system. As Mark was saying, there are IT glitches that occur every single day. Okay, how it's not different. Y2K was an artificial environment because partly a lot of precautionary measures were taken down. So we didn't have a true test of hackers and those with malicious intent, for instance, going out there and doing that, because not all the computer systems that they might have been targeting were up for them to do that. And a lot of electricity systems, were powered down. Secondly, it was a known risk with relatively fixed date and time. A lot of the risks that actually are occurring already, as Mark said, a lot of IT glitches occur every day. We never know. All of a sudden you're typing away in your computer and something zap happens and you don't know what it is. Same in future. We're not certain, who or when something might attack us. And how Y2K is not like other threats. Here's another kind of example. Y2K affected all parts of society and all types of systems, but when you're dealing with critical infrastructure, you're actually focusing on a more narrow set of objects. Okay. Lessons to be learned, or you often hear lessons learned, right? That's the standard. It's actually lessons to be learned, because to be means you incorporate and you institutionalize new procedures and mechanisms. 3 lessons that I look at. One is on technology and information management. This really is about good housekeeping, and it's boring, right? Absolutely boring, because who likes to do spring cleaning all the time? And you have to do spring cleaning all the time with IT management, not just in the springtime, even though it's probably likely that we, even with IT, only do it so now and again. And there are, however, various standards and guidelines that either have been implemented already in the past but are now being upgraded, or are actually being introduced. And what I've heard, there are 4 kinds of areas. One, IT procurement is now actually going through boards of directors. it used to be before someone buy a computer, they go out and get one. Now it has to be checked out and I guess owned by someone. Secondly, peer and independent review of IT project implementation is now being institutionalized. Okay. At our conference in January, we had someone say that 25% of IT projects come in on time, on budget, and actually work. That means 75% of them don't, and we all know of major systems that are being implemented, and there's no review. There's a lot of money lost as a result of that. So this is now being institutionalized. The UK government has actually institutionalized it in their one of their cycles. There is an existing international standard on management assurance. Okay, so there's talk about beefing that up. And there's also been a major report which has promoted to move risk assessment, which traditionally has been at the level of accountant manager, to the level of the board of director. So that risk assessment now becomes a corporate liability to be examined. And it's within that risk assessment area that companies in future will have to be reporting in their annual reports what they have done to minimize or deal with risk. Government industry cooperation as a second kind of lesson to be learned. Focus has tended to be, at least in the United States, in the West, on what industry is going to do to protect critical infrastructure, because in the West, private sector owns it. So there's this great fear of, my gosh, government has the responsibility of dealing with national security, but oh boy, private industry owns it, and therefore they can't do anything about it. Well, firstly, if you own a company or own infrastructure, which means owning a company, you have every motivation to make sure that it runs well. You don't want to lose money. Now, it may be that it's a liability and profit motive that's making sure that you run your system and protect its assets. But whatever the motive is, the implication is that they will therefore do their best to protect it. Where the scope for research is when there might be a national threat, some kind of terrorist threat or something. No one has actually been able to find one or know of one. There haven't really been major ones reported. At what point will industry have to do more than what they already do to deal with that kind of issue? Again, developing countries' own infrastructure, so you have government already there involved in that. Okay, no. That one was still to be learned. International-national interaction. We see some institutionalization process occurring. One, how is the momentum of the International Y2K Coordination Center being maintained? We had the UN, the chairman of the UN Working Group on Informatics, which sired the IY2KCC. We've heard recently that Kofi Annan has had a task force report on IT development, and the United Nations currently, in its ECOSOC substantive meetings in New York now, are saying how can we implement the recommendations of this task force. And this working group that sired the IYCC is actually going to be the body to try to figure out how governments, industry, and civil society, okay, so they've actually brought in the factor I've left out, are going to come together to fund IT development projects. And this is hot off the press. But it's a move. This is unprecedented in the UN to have that kind of attention on information technology kinds of issues. And people try to examine, where might their lessons be to deal with environmental issues and hunger and famine. I do suspect that there will perhaps be a slowdown in that task force, because if you don't have an immediate crisis, you won't necessarily have that momentum. This brings me down to the multinational monitoring and help desks set up by industry. And as one of the questioners in the audience said before, if the motivation isn't there, companies are not going to keep these networks, these international networks set up. There's no there's no business motive to do that. And so there are some companies who set up their international monitoring system over the Y2K rollover, and it was the first time they had done that, though they did build it on top of their existing emergency coordination systems, but they've also now stood them down. But the lesson I would argue here that has been learned is that they know they can do it if they need to do it. So I like to have some salvation in there. The other sector-based monitoring and sharing schemes, we have had the scheme that was set up to monitor nuclear power plants over the rollover is now being adopted by the International Atomic Energy Agency with some modifications, and will be used to be a better system than the one they currently have to track and monitor incidents that might arise from nuclear power incidents. The International Telecommunications Union also had a monitoring set up, and that is being used now as part of the efforts to monitor intrusion detection amongst government, or at least government industry telecommunications networks. It has the cooperation of the industry. And ISSSS are the Information Sharing and Analysis Centers, which have been set up. The one so far that is actually up and running is the one for the financial services, and it is actually a voluntary one where the banks and institutions which are in the financial services sector, that they share information amongst themselves on any kinds of intrusions that they have on their in their systems. It's a start. But it actually has been institutionalized. So I can say these are lessons that have been learned as a result of Y2K. They are also, as I said before, not very well known about, understandably, because not everyone was involved in Y2K. That's it. If you have any questions, that's just what I have.
Okay, so here's a quick overview of Carl Mueller's presentation, and then we'll have general discussion. He calls it Y2K 7 months after, 2 double binds and a double blindness. And he's with the Institute for Advanced Studies in Vienna, Austria. Carl approaches an understanding of Y2K from a theoretical point of view on the nature of information societies. This is a very European approach to things. Americans tend to be very pragmatic. In my experience, Europeans are more theoretical. Carl has developed something he calls an epigenetic theory. Think of 2 things, the genotype and the phenotype, the information and the organism. The idea being that information can be encoded in any number of different kinds of structures, DNA, the brain, books, maps, etc. Then you have the organism or the organization. And this constant change in movement, where one affecting the other, the genotype affecting the phenotype, affecting the genotype, affecting the phenotype, occurs at all levels throughout society. Carl has distinguished what he calls 4 different kinds of societies. a Darwinian society, a Polanyi society, a Piagetian society, and a Turing society. Now, what does he mean by these things? First, in a Darwinian society, changes in information in the genotype occur in the genes. So there is no learning within the lifespan of a single organism, only a genetic drift over time. Insects would be an example. In a Polanyi society, some learning by individual organisms occurs. For example, dogs, porpoises, etc. In a Piagetian society, not only do specific organisms learn, but there's a transferal of learning from one organism to another and from one generation to another. And an example would be human societies that are characterized by language, science, communication, and technologies. And then he distinguishes what he calls a Turing society. A Turing society is one in which some decision-making activities are performed by machines, not just human beings, but also machines. So Carl would maintain that since the invention of the silicon chip, or at least since computers, we live in a Turing society. The Y2K data suggested they're in the neighborhood of 5 to 10 billion, I think was the number, chips or program logic controllers, or maybe it was 70 billion. Yeah, I think it was 70 billion. Up to 70 billion program logic controllers in existence around the world. Well, if we have 6 billion human beings, that's about 10 times as many Turing creatures as there are human beings. And these Turing creatures are not equally distributed around the world along with the human beings. They're concentrated in the more developed societies. Most of these little chips or Turing creatures are not date sensitive, but if those that are date sensitive were to malfunction simultaneously, it would be somewhat like, say, the garbage workers going on strike. People would become aware of their existence. So throughout this presentation, there will be references to Turing societies. And by a Turing society, he means a knowledge society, a society inhabited by chips and elementary robots in addition to human beings. Okay. He then does the various taxonomies of the kinds of problems that organizations face. Whether they're predictable or unpredictable, whether they're local or global, and whether they're transferable or non-transferable in time. In the case of Y2K, the problem itself was eminently predictable. Everybody knew about it 40 years ago. The consequences were very difficult to predict. I'll get to that in a minute. Local or global, clearly it was global, although it was concentrated in the developed countries. But let me deal with the concept of transferable or non-transferable in time. Governments deal with two kinds of problems. Problems that are transferable in time are chronic problems, problems of unemployment, rising health standards, drug abuse, etc. You don't have to have a solution this year. It would be nice, but the problem is going to be around next year as well. A non-transferable in time problem would be a problem, say, like an invasion or an earthquake or a hurricane, something that happens immediately and has to be dealt with. But most of the problems that are not transferable in time tend also to be not predictable. In other words, it's very difficult to predict earthquakes, hurricanes somewhat. Y2K was different because it was predictable and it was non-transferable in time. He also references the work of Charles Perrow, who created normal accident theory, NAT, normal accident theory. This grew out of Perrow's work on 3 Mile Island. There are two major conclusions from Perrow's study of the 3 Mile Island accident. First was that it takes a lot of things to go wrong before you have an accident. Many things have to go wrong, and usually human error is one of them, so that our systems are fairly robust. On the other hand, there's also the fact that there are so many things going on all the time that it's just a matter of time before all these various things fall into place, and indeed there is an accident. So his conclusion from 3 Mile Island was that it wasn't that any one specific thing went wrong, rather it was a normal accident. It was a kind of irreducible problem, regardless of how many safeguards you have. And what Perot did was he distinguished complex systems, linear systems versus very complex systems, in coupling, whether it was loose or tight. People did not know how to characterize Y2K. It seemed at first that it was loosely coupled, that is, you just fix each system independently, and it seemed like a not terribly complicated technological problem. But when you look at all the interconnections and when you look at the threat to the infrastructure, then it looked rather more like a tight coupling complex system. Okay, so he would maintain that Y2K was the first major challenge to modern knowledge societies. What he means by that is the kinds of problems we've had to deal with in the past have been natural disasters like earthquakes, floods, hurricanes, etc., or deliberate human bad actions like wars, invasions, torture, etc. But in the case of Y2K, it was a human-created problem, but it was one that we overlooked and simply did not deal with. And that as we live more and more in an artificial human-created environment, an oversight can be the kind of a threat that we have not previously dealt with. So it was a new type of social coordination problem. It required coordination activity at a rather low level, as I think Mark said, around the world in a very short period of time. Y2K furthermore resulted from encoding time in a relatively short cycle in machine code. That is, if our calendar system had been different, Y2K could have happened at any time. And it was the fact that we chose a very short interval to represent time that led to the problem. There was nothing inherent in the technology. It was the way we chose to represent time that led to the problem. And Y2K was a frame problem error. Now, the concept of the frame problem comes out of artificial intelligence. A frame problem is choosing an incorrect definition of the problem. If you choose an incorrect definition of the problem, it's very difficult to solve the problem. Let me give you an example of what I mean by that. Many of you probably know that technical journals, magazines, review new software. A new software product comes out, somebody writes a review of it. It's like a book review. How do you evaluate the software? Generally on the basis of speed, features, and ease of use. Very slightly priced, they're usually competitive. If the reviewers of software had included an additional category, is it Y2K compliant? And if they had done that back, say, 1990, the vendors, the suppliers of software, would have had to include Y2K compliance in their products. But because the reviewers of software didn't do that, there was no pressure on the suppliers to do so. That's just one example of the way in which Y2K was a frame problem error. There were two ways in which we misunderstood Y2K. The first was a requisite variety issue. That is, the fundamental problem of Y2K was the judgment that there was not time and there was not sufficient manpower to fix everything that needed to be fixed in the time available. That's a requisite variety, the law of requisite variety. The variety in the regulator has to be at least as great as the variety in the system being regulated. The assumption was that the variety to be controlled was greater than the variety available to regulate it. Furthermore, the assumption behind all of the contingency planning was that since not everything was going to be fixed, the disruptions that would occur had the potential of overwhelming the emergency response capability. Turned out that assumption was wrong. We were right that not everything got fixed, but we were wrong that the ability to control the problem would be overwhelmed. The second error was in the centrality of the errors. Let's take a case. If you're a business corporation and the guy that ships you paper clips goes out of business because he can't process orders, you just buy your paper clips from another supplier. It's not a major issue. But if the electric power company goes down, then in a sense you have to shut up shop until the electric power comes back. So that there are some features in a society that are central. And the thought was that Y2K posed a risk to the central activities of the society, which would then have ripple effects, so that if the electric power grid went, then the manufacturer might go, and then the mortgage companies that depend on the salaries from the workers and et cetera and the customers, so that you could have primary, secondary, tertiary effects from the failure of central mechanisms. And that turned out not to be the case. Okay, this is what he means by a double bind. And here he is, well, there's one other phrase. Carl is very articulate in some ways. I'd like to read to you just a few of the statements he makes. He tends to be a little critical at times, but it's amusing. Y2K reveals an astonishing insight on the time horizons of human decision-making procedures. Since even knowledge with certainty about the future, like the 4-digit date change problem, continued in software created as late as 1995, 1996, and even 1998. But people discounted this fact as either irrelevant or, more to the point, treated as time transferable. In other words, human beings have extraordinarily short decision-making time horizons, at least as revealed by our Y2K experience. Okay, so double bind one. Before the fact, scientists did not perceive Y2K to be a major risk to society, so there was no need for an intensive interdisciplinary study of it. On the other hand, since there was no interdisciplinary study of Y2K before the fact, it did not appear as a major risk to society. He's talking now about the scientific community. The second double bind is, after the fact, scientists did not perceive Y2K to have been a major risk to society, so there was no need for an interdisciplinary understanding of it. On the other hand, since there were so few interdisciplinary analyses of Y2K after the fact, it did not appear to have been a major risk to society. And then finally, a double blindness. Before the fact, data proved to be misleading in terms of potential impact. After the fact, the almost perfect rollover has stopped data collection on Y2K-induced failures by both the scientific and the non-scientific world, with a few notable exceptions. Okay, now let me just read you a little bit of what Carl has to say, because I think it's so wonderful.
Will you be wrapping up line 6?
Yeah, I will. Okay, where is it here? At this point, it seems worthwhile to point out first that the novelty of the Y2K challenges transcended the existing disciplinary boundaries completely. Viewed in terms of core competencies, no scientific discipline was equipped to deal with the complex ramifications of Y2K issues. For the domain of information or computer sciences, Y2K was a highly trivial problem to be solved by the end users of computer hardware and software. For science studies, Y2K was an ill-defined problem that at best, since it dealt with mainly programs, codes, and program errors. For technology assessments, it was uncommon to investigate the societal fate of trivial program errors. For economists, the neoclassical background offered no suitable link between model constructions and errors in time measurement. Social scientists in general were very slow to adapt to the new features of contemporary knowledge societies in general, and to the machine code domains in particular. A complete enumeration by disciplines would reveal very clearly that problems of the Y2K type, due to their novelty and due to their all-inclusive character, were not part of the established disciplinary core competencies. Well, that's basically why I thought Y2K was a wonderful opportunity for the system sciences. And the reason that Peter and I decided to have this session was that we thought that there would be some disruptions in January, noticeable disruptions, with some kind of ripple effects or cascade effects, that this would be on the evening news, and that there would be opportunities for system scientists to explain the interconnectedness of modern societies, to do suitable studies, and to rise to the forefront of public consciousness. So, despite the threats, it posed an opportunity for system scientists, but as we can see, the system scientists aren't all that much more interested than academics in general, it seems. So thank you all very much for coming. If there are any questions, I think we're all three will entertain them. Yes? Saved? Well, I'll let both Mark and Olivia reply to that too. If we had studied it farther in advance, how many billions would have been saved? First off, we could have incorporated it into the normal upgrade process. On the other hand, a lot of organizations did not have a routine, well-ordered upgrade process. So I think that clearly starting earlier would have been less expensive, less traumatic. Information could have been shared, etc. And all of this activation of emergency response could have been largely eliminated. On the other hand, we learned a lot from doing this, so that the creation of a crisis prodded people to do things that they had not done before. And the fact that IT rose to the level of the board of directors was, in a sense, an admission that the IT guys weren't doing the job. In other words, if they had been doing the job, things would have continued as usual. But the feeling of the board of directors is, you guys weren't minding the store, you put the company at risk, we're going to watch you.
I have to say that this is a great big example